Welcome back. So this is going to be the second part of the discussion of Cosmovisions and the Maya and the Popol Vuh. And this part is going to talk really about historical context, so we can work out a bit, well, basically so we can place what we're talking about into some sort of historical overview. Yeah, so the Mayan civilizations, arguably they were at their peak, roughly speaking, using a Western calendar. This is a modern Western calendar. They're at their peak, roughly speaking, in the years between 600 to 900 AD, or Common Era, if you'd rather use that terminology. And this is the period when Mayan culture flourished across the region that's now Guatemala and southern Mexico. And this is where the famous cities of Palenque and Tikal in the Yucatan Peninsula, and Copan in the south. This is where these cities are at their height. This is also when Chichen Itza was founded. And you might recognize, you might have visited these places as a tourist, or you might recognize them from photographs, or even actually. And for any sci-fi fans of you out there, you'll probably recognize it from the original Star Wars film, in which one of the rebel bases was filmed in Tikal. So yeah, you might be familiar with these sites for various reasons, really. But it's these places really that people think of when they talk about the Mayan civilization. And during this period, so this period between 600 and 900 AD, the Maya even established a presence in Nahua, controlled, or Nahua, central Mexico. The Maya of the south are in constant communication with the Nahua peoples of central Mexico through trade. And of course, that has a significant impact on cultural exchange. Which culture affects which first? In some ways, it's a bit of a futile question. It's a kind of chicken and the egg question, really, which came first. Because on the one hand, the Nahua culture was firmly present and dominant in the Mayan heartlands during the time of the earlier civilization of Teotihuacan. And it was when Teotihuacan collapsed and it had a Mayan subsidiary, Caminaljuyu, when that declined as well, in roughly AD 600, that Mayan culture flowered to fill the power vacuum. So this is when you enter the Classic Maya period, and these city-states expanded their trade networks and established their colonies in central Mexico. So it's important. One thing you can note is that the Maya culture at its height is present in central Mexico prior to the all-important Toltec hegemony, which is supposedly such a huge cultural impact on the Mexica, the later Mexica, and subsequently on what's become known as the Aztec Empire. And we'll talk about that in later podcasts. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that while Nahua culture and languages are really very different to Maya culture and languages, the Mayan language, and just as an example of that, the Mayan language family itself is a vast and quite mutually unintelligible family. There are clearly parallels and points of connection within these two broad cultures, so the Maya culture and the Nahua culture. And these aren't likely to be coincidental, but they're rather due to extended contact over hundreds, if not thousands of years, and cultural exchange over this period. So, Mayan culture is at its height between the years 8600 to 900. And it's controlled by these large cities such as Copan, Palenque, and Tikal. So what happened then? Well, the Mayan city-states entered seemingly a downward spiral of overpopulation, environmental degradation due to a combination of overfarming, increasingly poor soil due to nutrients being washed away by rains, and also felling of the rainforests, and subsequent climatic disasters that kind of result in that, which in turn causes malnutrition, famine, and that's as a result of overpopulation, underproduction of foodstuffs. Add to that the fact that the growing city-states of central Mexico, they're developing sea trade routes and they're bypassing the Mayan interior. So these are all kind of suggestions as to why these city-states declined. And you might ask, well, okay, what's this got to do with Cosmovision? Well, even if we leave aside the Popol Vuh for the moment, and you can see the Cosmovision reflected or demonstrated in the Popol Vuh, on the most basic level, this kind of rise of city-states and the decline, you're seeing the rise and fall of civilizations. You're talking in cyclical time. This is this universal framework that you just can't get away from. And the impact on, so the historical impact on the city-states is profound. So these city-states are theocracies. The nobility rule through communication with the gods, and they don't tolerate any challenge or any opposition. And as an example of this, we can look in the Popol Vuh, which describes an uprising. So it describes the uprising of the Iloks against the Quiche lords. And this is a later period than the one we're talking about right now, but the concept of theocracy and strict hierarchy is very much the same. So the Iloks rebel, and the Quiche put down the rebellion. And the Popol Vuh describes it as, or in its description it says, such were the roots of disturbances of tumult and war. First they invaded the citadel. The killers were on the move. What they wanted was to obliterate the very identity of the Quiche. Only then, they thought, could they alone have sovereignty, and it was for this alone that they came to kill. They were captured and they were made prisoners. And then began the cutting of the flesh. They cut the Iloks open before the gods. This was in payment for their wrongs against Lord Noble Sweatbath, who was the ruler at the time. And many others went into bondage. They were made into serfs and slaves. And that's taken from Tedlock's translation of the Popol Vuh, and it's on page 182. Anyway, this does refer to a later period. So this is after the collapse of the classic Mayan civilization, which roughly occurred in about 925 AD, or Common Era. But even so, the message is clear. The punishment for those who rebel against the divine rulers is sacrifice. If they're lucky, it's slavery. Now, archaeological evidence seems to point towards the theory, and I say it very tentatively because those of you archaeologists will know that archaeology is a pretty inexact science in many ways. So it points towards the theory that the collapse of the classic Mayan cities of Copán, Palenque, and Tikal, and these other city-states was very rapid, very violent. And the supposition is that the city-states and their subject populations were pretty much stretched to breaking point. And this is in a context of climactic disaster, famine, and warfare. So the nobles and the kings, they're in constant communication with the gods through sacrifice, human sacrifice in particular, and they're getting no answers. So it seems as if the gods are no longer favouring the priestly kings or listening to their petitions. So basically, they're not doing their jobs properly, they're not it's not worth listening to them. So the populations rise up and they slaughter the priestly families and they destroy the sacred sites and left these large cities to be swallowed up by the jungle. At least that's the supposition, the theory. So in effect, if we take that theory as correct, the very population, the Mayan population themselves, are the ones who put the nail in the coffin of the classic Maya civilization, and also confirm their worldview of cycles of destruction and rebirth. So the destruction as ordained by the gods was already happening. It was happening at that moment. The population, though, is the final instrument of destruction before Mayan civilization can be reborn again. From that point on, through to the Spanish invasion, which started in the mid-1520s and lasted into the 1530s, Mayan culture is characterized by a smaller by smaller cities and towns that are founded on lake shores, by rivers and near estuaries, and in particular close to, I suppose, due to the kind of geographical topography of the region, these really large, extremely beautiful water holes called cenotes that provide the water for these cities. And it's in that period that we see the rise of the Quiche kingdom in the south, which is centered around the city of Comarca, and that's close to that city that the Spanish founded Santa Cruz del Quiche after they conquered the territory. We also see simultaneously the rise of Mayapan in the north, in the Yucatan Peninsula, and both these kingdoms dominate their respective regions through conquest and receive tribute from their dominated neighbours. Both cities give prominence to a divine king called a plumed serpent, and we'll see him appear next week as the feathered serpent, the Nahua or Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, and also the power bases of both kingdoms is in networks of Maya and Nahua families. This is something to bear in mind as well. And that's where we'll leave the context for now. In the next section, we'll move on to talk about the Popol Vuh and the phenomenon of dualities